today's lecture is going to be about Aristotle. We covered Plato's Metaphysics. We spoke about the allegory of the cave, the theory of the forms, the tripartite soul, as well as his moral philosophy and his idea of the state as man writ large. So essentially, what Plato did was he took psychology, he took the psychology of the individual and sort of stretched it. He pulled it in such a way as to cover how he saw society as function. So what he essentially did was he took the individual psychology, or the psychology in a very proto sense of psychology. It's a very early idea of what psychology was in 2,500 years ago. We're not talking, 20th century psychology, but he took essentially what was his idea of the human mind and used it as a metaphor for society. So what we'll be doing next is we will be looking at Aristotle in today's lecture. We will be looking at his metaphysics, Aristotle as the founder of this thing called metaphysics, his ideas about being and becoming. He had this notion of the difference between having the potential and having actuality, and being and becoming is closely linked to this. As we cover this, we will also look at his four causes he had. We'll look at his theory of knowledge, then we will look at his idea of man as a rational animal. Aristotle is famous, especially, not just, but he's famous as well for making two claims: that man is a rational animal, and of course this does not exclude women, especially today. It's anachronistic, but today we consider women part of that, as well as social beings. So he defines the individual as a rational being, but then also defines a collection of individuals as somehow an entity of itself, the society. And that should wrap up our discussion for today. Now, as we begin, let's have a look at some background on Aristotle. So first of all, Aristotle was a follower of Plato. He started his foray in philosophy at quite a young age. He was born in Stagira. He grew up in Stagira, which was separate from Athens, but he was sent at Plato's academy, and he spent more or less 20 years there. He started, first of all, he was a student, but eventually became a star member of the academy. Plato started gathering his followers in one place and organizing lectures and discussions, and the place he chose, a green place owned by a guy called Academus. Therefore, we have academia, which means the place owned by Academus. And this is how today we get the word academia, for instance. This is where it comes from that very original place owned by Academus, used by Plato and his fellow philosophers to practice their thing. And Aristotle grew up there, philosophically grew up there, intellectually he cut his teeth in Plato's place. And then he spent 20 years, like I said. Eventually things shifted. Plato grew old. At some point, Aristotle was thought to be the guy to lead the school. something went wrong somewhere. He wanted to travel. At the same time, there were some claim that there were machinations and interior machinations of those shoving him aside. Perhaps they were scared of him. Perhaps too much, too much intellectual power. Perhaps for other reasons. But he was somehow someone else took that place, that coveted place, which would have been the head of school. Aristotle goes away. He travels a bit here and there. He goes to visit Macedonia, which was a separate place further north. And in Macedonia, he meets the king, and the king tells him, "Listen, I'd really like you to stay. I'll offer you whatever it is you want, and I'd like you to teach my son to do philosophy, essentially." And Aristotle, to cut a long story short, Aristotle agrees. He stays at the Macedonian king's court and ends up tutoring the son of the king. The son's name is Alexander. This guy would be Alexander the Great. He would go on to become great and do great things and conquer here and conquer there and knock on the doors of India and then get malaria and die at the age of 22, if I'm not mistaken, or in his 20s. Aristotle survives all of this. He had already broken contact with, he had already left the court before Alexander grew to this stature of the great. But he sets up his own school. Aristotle then opens his own school back in Greece, and he becomes like the main sort of figure over there. Now, that's some background. Now, Aristotle is known for writing a lot. He wrote volumes and volumes of works. We have quite a vast record of what he thought, and most of it was gathered in lecture notes that we have. Now the question arises, but was it, when we're reading these lecture notes, are they his or is it someone else's writing? It could be someone else's writing. Could be he asked some fellow student perhaps, or one of the people there at the, not a fellow student, but one of his students there to perhaps help him make the lecture notes. But there's a stark difference between reading Plato and reading Aristotle. When you read Plato, you're reading a story. You're reading a bit of a plot, not much of a plot. It's not like one of these novels. But there's someone, and someone's a character, and they meet someone else, and then they start a discussion. So you have sort of this flow of narrative, rudimentary, but it's there when you're reading Plato. When you're reading Aristotle, on the other hand, you're lost in this dense labyrinth of words. And it's very helpful to read Aristotle with some guidance, usually, because essentially, like I said, these are lecture notes. And some would claim they weren't even meant to be published. So what we have is the remains of lecture notes meant to perhaps spark points in Aristotle's mind as he's proceeding through his lectures. Now, one sad thing about this is also that we don't have much left. We have lots left, but compared to what he wrote, there isn't that much left. Only about a third survives. One of the things Aristotle did was to take a topic and evolve it into a volume, into what we would call nowadays a book. He would take a topic and he would open it up, so to speak. He would think deeply about it until he has sort of exhausted everything he had to think about that topic. And there are several things that he talks about. He talks about biology and astronomy and physics and ethics, logic. One of those things he spoke about, one of those things he explored was what we call today metaphysics. Meta means beyond, physics means the physical. And it's curious why it's called such a thing. This is today's topic. This is what we will be talking about today. Aristotle's metaphysics. But what do we mean when we speak about beyond the physics? Let's look at the genesis of this. Let's look at the beginnings of this. We trace that word to Aristotle's works. Like I said, he spoke about a lot of things: botany and zoology and astrology, astronomy, and they were one thing. Astrology and astronomy back then, we didn't have the distinction we have today. One would say quack and the other science. It was one big area of study. Physics, etc. These volumes were strung in order. And at some point, there was this volume discussing the Earth and stuff related to the Earth and how the Earth works, and that would have been the physical stuff, right? The stuff about physics, the physical. Then you had a collection of writings that didn't really belong anywhere else. They weren't about animals, they weren't about logic or about the physical. So they put them all together. They seemed to have this common thing about them that they're not common with the others. And they spoke about things not really related to the other volumes. And they strung them together. And when they put Aristotle's works in order, they put them after the physical volume. So it became the metaphysical, the volume that comes in the library when you're looking at them, that comes after the physical. That's how we got the first name, the first use of the term metaphysics, after the physics. Now, metaphysics started off as this thing, it's just a name that comes after the physical. But of course, it took a life of its own, even as a term, even as a branch in philosophy. Aristotle's choice of name was first philosophy. So there was already an understanding, an inclination towards what this is about. It's not just, it doesn't just happen to be after the physical. Aristotle called this type of thinking first philosophy. And why is it first? Because it deals with fundamentals, it deals with the most basic questions of all, it deals with questions about existence, about the nature of things that exist. It deals with the fundamental nature of reality. What is reality made of? It deals with the relationship between mind and matter, between substance and attribute, a characteristic. Substances would be individual things. When I say a thing, I can say a pencil. A pencil is a thing. A pencil is a substance. But then that substance has attributes such as weight, size, color, how bold it writes, what sound does the pencil make that's different from using chalk, for instance. That would be an attribute of this particular substance, this particular pencil, this particular individual thing. Metaphysics talks also about the difference between potentiality and actuality, potential being and actual being. And to wrap up this small bracket about the definition of metaphysics, and we've been talking about substance, in Aristotelian terminology, material would not be the same as substance. They're different things. So material has parallels with substance insofar as primary matter serves as sort of like a substratum, like a bottom layer for simpler bodies, like sand and rock, atmosphere and wind. This is quite an ancient way of thinking about things, but in Aristotle's time, there's this distinction between the atmosphere and wind. The atmosphere would be a substratum, the wind would be the substance per se. And you have different ways of talking about substances too. You have secondary substances, and then you have substances in a primary sense. Secondary substances would also apply. You can have secondary substances when you think of, say, man made things. When you think of individuals, of human beings, you're talking of primary substances in that sense. When we cover Kant, we see how Kant looked as human beings as having value in and of themselves. You treat other human beings as having inherent value. It's not about their use. This has parallels in Aristotle when he talks of human beings as being a primary substance. Now, in metaphysics, Aristotle criticizes Plato's theory of forms. We've looked at Plato's theory of forms last time. We said that Plato had this idea that this form is perfect, it is ideal, it's eternal, and what we see around us sort of correspond to those forms. When you lie your head on your pillow tonight and you lay down on the bed, that bed, as comfortable as it feels, it's never the perfect bed. The perfect bed is an idea you can access rationally. You can never really lie in the perfect bed. Now, Aristotle would criticize, of course, Plato talks about more than just the bed. He talks about tables and goodness and justice and beauty, about all these things, right? We can never experience pure beauty, pure justice, pure goodness here. Why? Because purity, in that sense, that level of perfection goes beyond. It's beyond the physical. In this sense, we can already start addressing Plato's theory of forms as being metaphysical, therefore. It goes beyond the physical. So for Plato, as we said last time, the forms, the ideas are perfect. They are eternal things to which correspond those perishable things and properties that we find in the world. And for Plato, the forms are abstract things. They are things that exist completely outside space and time. Aristotle comes along, and Aristotle knew his Plato, and he said, "You know what? I disagree. I beg to differ, Mister Plato. The forms do not exist independently of things. They are intrinsically linked to objects. You can't have an object unless you have the form. When things exist, they have to have both substance and form. You have to have them together. in the same place. So, one of the things that made Aristotle, that pushed Aristotle to criticize Plato in this sense, was that he felt that Plato's theory of form didn't quite address the issue of change. The story of change goes back a bit in the history of philosophy. It predates Plato and Aristotle by a couple of centuries at least. And there are two figures that we will be looking at soon enough, called Parmenides and Heraclitus. But before I get to that point, let me just introduce the notion of being and becoming, which will then lead us also to potentiality and actuality. So Aristotle's understanding of being was quite different from Plato's. Um, for Aristotle's for Aristotle, only individual beings, only individual things, the substances, are fully beings. You can have other things such as quality and quantity, what he calls place and time and relation. These things he calls categories. But these things, when you have, for instance, quantity or quality, these are kinds of being. The quality of being red, the quantity of a dozen, of 12, of half a dozen, of 6, of 10, of 1. These things are derivative. They have derivative kind of being. It's a type of being that depends on individual substances. So you need to have a substance. You need to have a crayon, say. What color is it? That's a derivative being. You can't have redness unless you have a color, unless you have the crayon, say. You can't have redness unless you have the strawberry. You can't have a dozen unless you have a dozen of something. 12 on its own does not exist. Its being, its being is derivative. It's a type of being that depends on something else, on the being of something else. 12 exists because you can have 12 objects. You need those objects to exist for 12 to exist. Likewise, you need to have red things to exist for redness to exist. So, this type of being is derivative, it depends on individual substances. Therefore, all notions of being for Aristotle derive from a single central notion, that of substance. And the term we need to get familiar with here is ousia, Ousia, Ousia. Each individual substance is a mutable thing. It changes. It's made of two correlative principles. You have form and you have matter. So when we talk about change, what is it? What are we talking about? And like we said a few minutes ago, the issue of change went back decades and centuries from the time of Aristotle. Most notably, the pre-Socratic philosophers tried to make sense of a changing world. You see the world going from season to season. First, you have the snowy one, and then you have the green one, followed by the really hot one. Remember, this is Greece, not exactly Norway. Then after the very hot one, things start to change a bit, and certain trees lose their leaves. We no longer have those types of fruits. Now we have more wintry fruits. And then that leads us again to perhaps the bitter, biting, cold winds of the Aegean Sea. in December and January and February. So you have this progression of seasons. You have fruit that grows old and all wrinkly and just disintegrates. You have animals and plants that die. You have crops that, unless you take care of them, they die. You have people who, even if you take care of them, they still die. Um, so you have this constant change happening around you. They saw how living things grew up, they matured, and then they broke down and died. When things died, they decomposed. So the possibility of change in a thing that has being, that exists, seems to be there. And we have two major pre Socratic philosophers traditionally associated with the issue of change, and these are Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides is known for his view that change is an illusion. Change isn't real. Nothing changes, said Parmenides. There is this pure, perfect, eternal being behind nature. This would be the ultimate truth of being. Parmenides would reject the validity of sense experience. So we see this change that we're talking about, we see nature decaying, nature decomposing, but Parmenides would say, but these are the senses talking to us. This seems to be deceiving us in some way, and using logic and reasoning, therefore, Parmenides concluded that only one thing exists. All things must be one. For things to change, this is Parmenides' argument, so hold on to your seats. For things to change, they have to go from being to non-being. Imagine you're in a room and you want to leave that room, right? From your being in the room, you go to your non-being in the room. So from being, you go to non-being. Then you want to go into the room again. So from non-being, you go to being, of course, in the room, right? And we're not talking about you disappearing out of existence and then suddenly reappearing out of existence in a general life sense. We're talking about you situated somewhere, but you're in a room, you're being in the room. Once you leave the room, you go to non-being in the room. So then it acts also vice versa. If you want to come back in, you go from non-being in the room to being in the room. And this is where it gets interesting, because Parmenides argues that even non-being is being. Our ability to think and talk about non-being transforms it into being. So when we talk of non-being, we're making that non-being being. We're giving it place. We're place holding it. We're making it. We're changing its existence essentially. Now you may disagree. You have the full rights to disagree with this, but this is his argument. So when we talk about non-being, we somehow transform it from non-being to being. Therefore, there's no such thing as non-being. Non-being is in fact being. So when we talk of being or non-being, whatever, doesn't make a difference. We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about being. So, if we're talking about being, they should be one. The oneness of things, the famous oneness of things, which I mentioned 2 minutes ago, right? When he says that everything is one, because everything exists. Change is an illusion. Since all things therefore are one, then nothing can be changed. This is where then change is an illusion. So everything we can think of is a false representation of the unity of being, the unity of everything. This is called monism. This type of thinking, this thinking about oneness, this philosophy of oneness, is called monism. And reality, according to Parmenides, then is like a perfect sphere. It's infinite, it's unchanged, it's eternal. The senses cannot understand this unity since they give us inconsistent information. The senses deceive us. We can arrive at such conclusions only through rational thinking. We can go beyond the false appearances of senses. We can then arrive at fundamental truths. Now, um, we have someone else talking about this, and the next guy who spoke about change was Heraclitus of Ephesus, around about 5 centuries BCE. This guy said the exact opposite thing of what Parmenides said. So essentially, he claimed that the one constant thing in a constantly changing world was the logos. But let's unpack this claim. So, things in the world tend to have opposing tendencies. So if you look at, you boil your favorite pot of water for pasta, you want to cook pasta, or you boil a kettle, and you boil it, and then you turn it off, and then you make your tea, say, or you've cooked your pasta, and then after 45 minutes, you feel like having more pasta or having more tea. What do? You go back to your kettle or to your pot, and you do your next pasta or tea, never together. But what happens is that you notice that this water has gone cold. So hot water goes cold. Likewise, it's middle of summer, blistering heat, you have your favorite cup glass of whatever infusion you like, nice ice cubes and everything, leave it for half an hour, it's August. So it's 40-degree weather in the Mediterranean. You have your favorite glass of whatever coldness you have, leave it for enough time, and it becomes absolutely tea. You can boil pasta in it then. So ice melts. Living things grow old, they decay. Heraclitus saw this. This seems to be quite real to me. I don't know if now I can speak to you, but in half an hour or in a day or in a month, I can't do that anymore because you're no longer there, because you've died. That is something the experience of it. You can't just spin it all. Oh, but it's all an illusion. It's not really. They're still there. No, they're not. Right? They died. They are no more. And we can argue about afterlife and this stuff, fair enough, but here and now they don't exist anymore. You can't talk to them. So this is where Heraclitus is coming from. And may I remind you that he said that the one constant thing in a constantly changing world was the logos. Now, the meaning of logos is a bit subject to interpretation. But the most commonly understood understood meaning is reason. So when he says logos, he seems to be referring to a way, reasoning, right? Logic is derived from logos. When we study things, biology, logo, we're studying life. For instance, astrology, astrologos, studying the stars, aster. So again, the logos has different meanings, but one of them is related to reason. And in this case, logos is a universal principle of order and knowledge. And Heraclitus symbolizes this by fire. It's his way of representing logos. Imagine logos as being a flame, as being a fire. You look at a flame, it never stands still. It dances throughout its existence. What better symbol can you have? Well, I have one, goes Heraclitus. No man ever steps in the same river twice. So you're going from fire to water. It is quite a shift. But again, when you think of rivers, you're thinking of things that are constantly rushing, they're constantly changing. If you step in a river, it's this river this second. In half a second, the water I was standing in has gone half a mile down. If it's a very fast river, but essentially this is what it is. It's constant motion. There's a constant flow of things. This is our life. It's constantly changing. This is existence. It's constantly going. This is being. Being is change. No man ever steps in the same river twice. Everything flows. Panta rei. Panta, panta, everything. Rei, Rhei, flows, Greek. And this brings us back to our famous topic of today, which is Aristotle and the difference between being and becoming. It's difficult to tell what Heraclitus, what Heraclitus's river is, because it's constantly becoming something else. It's constantly changing. The present moment, it's not something you can grasp. It's ungraspable. We can't quite get it. It's ineffable. It's constantly shifting. It's fluctuating. Flux, right? It's rushing. On the other hand, in contrast, you have Parmenides as being or reality. It's even that sort of reality is ineffable, although what makes it beyond description is that it lies beyond experience for Parmenides. Remember, Parmenides told us, the senses deceive you. Heraclitus is not, or Heraclitus is not, but no, but Parmenides told us that this is beyond experience. So we can't really grasp, in Parmenides' case, we can't grasp being because it's beyond experience. Things that are, that is, things that have being. When they exist, they have being. To say that a table is to say something about being. It's to say something about the being of the table, yes, but it's also claiming something about being itself, to be itself. To say that a table is, for example, let's say that the table is blue. You have a blue table. It's also saying something about being, about the being of that table. But when we talk of becoming, we're also saying something about being. It says something about the possibility of change in a thing that has being. Let's say this table that you have a blue table, right? That is its being. It is blue. It's a blue table. And you'd like to paint it red or black. You want to paint it black. So what do? First of all, I would guess you scrape off the red paint. I'm not a carpenter, but this is my guess. So you scrape off the red paint, you put on a primer, what's like a bottom layer, and then on top of that, you start doing your black paint, your final layers. The red table or blue table, in the process of becoming black, goes through a shift. It goes through changes. It goes through a change. It was red, but it's becoming black. It's becoming black because it has the possibility to change. It has the possibility of going from potentially black to actually black. And this leads us then into the distinction between potentiality and actuality. Potentiality is what you have, what you don't actually, potentiality is what you don't yet have. You could have it, but you don't have it yet. That's potentiality. Actuality is what you actually have, what you have right now. So when the table is blue, it's actually blue, but it could be potentially black. It could also potentially be green if you change your mind. It could potentially be any color, the spectrum of colors. So things that have being, they have actuality. They actually exist in reality for a fact. Actual things are things that have form. But actual things also have potentiality. They have the possibility to have forms other than their current one. If they currently actually have one, these new forms are not yet actual. They don't exist yet, but they have the potential to exist. So potential things are things that have the possibility to have form. Let's take an example. The example of an acorn. The example of an oak tree. So if you take an acorn, and you know what an acorn is. Given the right conditions, this thing will eventually develop into a tree. If I'm holding an acorn in my hand, I can say that I'm holding an actual acorn. But I can't say I'm holding an actual tree. No, first of all, it's quite, I guess, next to impossible to hold an actual oak tree in your hand like this, unless it's in your dreams. But there's a difference between holding an acorn, clearly, and holding an actual oak tree, massive, big things. But I would be holding a potential oak tree if I'm holding an acorn, if I'm holding the seed of an apple tree. I'm not even, I'm not just not holding an acorn. I'm also not holding a potential oak tree. What I'm holding is potentially a future apple tree, right? So by holding an acorn, I am holding a potential oak tree. Why? Because the acorn has the potential to become a tree of this type. There are conditions it must meet, right? There has to be enough sunlight, there has to be enough water, it has to be in the right soil. But these things, given all the conditions, will allow that acorn to grow into that. So things that have the potential to develop into something are said to have what we call telos. Telos. It's a Greek term. We call it the final cause. It's the purpose or aim of an action. It's an end, the end towards which a thing naturally grows or develops or walks or journeys. And this telos, this final cause, is one of four. So there can be four causes according to Aristotle. That things that are have. Let's have a look. They're called the four causes of being. Aristotle lists these four in a way, in an attempt to answer the why questions. Right? He addresses this in his physics and metaphysics. So let's start with the first one. The first type of cause, he calls it matter. It's the stuff or material out of which something is made. In the case of a table, say, it could be the wood. In the case of a book, it's the paper. In the case of a car, it's metals and plastics and textiles. So the material cause of something, why does it exist? What is made of really? This thing about matter is what is stuff made of. It's matter. Well, what is something made of? It's the material cause of something. And that's the first of his four causes of being. The first one being hule, Hule, material cause. The second type of cause is form, or what he calls eidos. So, what shape, the sort of question we need to ask ourselves in order to answer questions about form would be what shape or appearance does the substance have? A table's formal cause is its shape, it's its design. So, a table necessarily, I think it's safe to claim, has a flat surface on some sort of support. That's a table. Then we can go further into that. And what it's a surface used for? It's a surface to, I don't know, perhaps eat on or do your homework on, right? So that's the formal cause on a table. What shape or appearance does the substance have? But even when I start then explaining how to use it, we're shifting away from the formal cause. The formal cause is just about the way it looks. It's the form it has, the shape it has, the design that it has. So, quick recap. The material cause of a table would be the wood. The formal shape of a table would be that it has a surface and a structural support, whether it's some sort of legs. You can have four, you can have three, you can have one leg in the middle. That's the formal cause. And now we move on a bit to the next one, which is called the efficient cause, or the moving cause, or the agent of it. What thing, other than the substance itself, is causing the substance to change or move? So it's anything other than the thing itself that causes the thing to change or to move. Let's say a table, right? What causes the table? What causes the table to be? What is the table's agent? What is the table's mover? The efficient cause in the sense, the agent cause in the sense, would be the carpenter. Take a child as an example, a separate example now, right? Still on the agent cause, on the efficient cause. But a child's efficient cause would be the parent. The parent causes the child to be. Therefore, the parent is the moving cause of the this particular substance, the child. Therefore, it's the agent. What we can also call kinun, Kinoun in ancient Greece. But then there's also one last cause, the fourth cause. And this is the cause we've discussed already, telos, the end cause, the purpose of something, the sake of which a thing is what it is. It's the potentiality of something, for something to take on an end form, a final form. And I'm bringing in a new example now. Think of a butterfly. When you have a butterfly, what does it start as? It starts, of course, as a small egg, and then this egg hatches, and you have a small caterpillar coming out, and this caterpillar eats many times its body weight until finally it goes in this semi hibernation state. Actually, it's a very active state where it creates a pupa and it grows into this beautiful winged thing that flutters around for a few weeks. So a caterpillar will finally become a butterfly. Its nature will cause it to reach that final stage. The telos, the final cause, the purpose of a caterpillar is to become a butterfly. That is its purpose. That's where it's going. That's where its being is pulling it. So now we can start to ask questions even about that table, because now we see, why does a caterpillar exist? It exists to become a butterfly. Why does a table exist? It exists for you to eat on, to dine on, to do your homework on, to do your crafts on, whatever, for you to climb on to reach high things if you don't have chairs or ladders. So this is the final cause. How is it you? Where is it going? So the final cause, the telos of a seed, may very well be the adult plant. And the final cause, the telos of a flowering plant, is to make a flower. And we can see how a plant that grows and makes flowers has reached its mature stage, which is what? To reproduce and have more plants. And this also links us in to the concept of eudaimonia now. We can see how and why Aristotle would consider eudaimonia such an important thing. Because it's the final cause, the flourishing of eudaimonia. It's not about being happy, it's about flourishing, it's about reaching your final state. It's about reaching a mature state. And for us human beings, it's not something we reach once and that's it. It's a lifelong pursuit. It's something you have to strive for. But you can see now parallels between his metaphysics and his ethics. They're linked. It's the same thinker after all. Not that the same thinker can't contradict himself, but in Aristotle's case, we can see a progression of thought there. Now let's move on a bit and discuss Aristotle's theory of knowledge. Aristotle's theory of knowledge is known as well, it's one of the first attempts to discuss knowledge. We had Plato before him discussing knowledge. Aristotle continues this exploration started by Plato, and he goes into epistemology. So, what is epistemology? It is the theory of knowledge. When we discuss knowledge in a philosophical sense, when we discuss what is knowledge, for instance, we are discussing what is called epistemology. Epistemology. So, like Plato, Aristotle acknowledged that knowledge it can only be called knowledge if it is of something that is true. So we agree there, right? When someone claims to know something, they're claiming that they know that this thing is true. They're not just claiming to know that this thing is true, that thing has to be true. And that's the first clause, right? So when we claim knowledge, it has to be a belief. That belief has to be true. But also, it has to be justified. You have to be justified in believing that true belief. It's not enough for something to be true and for you to believe it to make your belief knowledge. You need something else on top. You need justifiability. And it must be justified in a way which shows that it must be true. It has to be necessarily true. No other way. And since physical particulars, for instance, beings or substances, can change, the object of knowledge cannot be the particular. It must be of that which is universal. Now, this is interesting because what he's saying here is that for us to claim real knowledge, this goes well with what Plato said. But for us to claim real knowledge, we can't claim knowledge of particular things, of substances that can change. The object of knowledge cannot be the particular. I can't claim knowledge of one bed. If I want to claim, that's something else. That's perhaps a belief. But if we want to claim knowledge, knowledge is something universal. So it's not about taste either, right? When I say strawberries are good, if by that I mean I love strawberries, I can't claim to that to be knowledge. If I claim my bed is really comfortable, I can't claim that to be knowledge. Why? Because that's subjective. If I want to claim it as knowledge, it has to be of objective truth. It has to be of universal truths. It has to be beyond the specifics of a substance. Has to be about things that go beyond personal experience, subjectivity. It has to be about universality. That is knowledge. That is true knowledge. Not of particulars, but of universals. So when I know, for instance, let's let's give an example of this. When I know that Lassie is a dog, when I claim that Lassie is a dog, I'm somehow claiming to have grasped something of the universal about Lassie. What do I mean? It means that I know that this particular thing, this particular perishable thing, I mean, Lassie the dog is a dog, is a specific dog. This dog in 14 years' time, it will be dead. No, 20 years, 25 years max, it will be dead. So this particular thing, it's perishable. It's a substance. And I can claim that this thing, Lassie, is a dog. However, in knowing that Lassie is a dog, I I can only make that claim if I also know something about the dogness of Lassie. Or what do I mean by the dogness of Lassie? I'm talking about those qualities that make Lassie a dog, right? So Lassie is to me clearly a dog. Rin Tin Tin is clearly a dog to me. Pluto, Scooby Doo, Snoopy, these are clearly dogs, right? They have this dogness about them, these qualities of being dogs. Those qualities are what I must recognize for me to be able to claim that Scooby Doo or Pluto or Snoopy or Rin Tin Tin or Fido or Lassie is a dog. So I also know about those universal dog qualities that make any dog a dog. I know that Lassie is a dog. However, should and when perhaps I finally meet Fido or I meet Goofy, I will not still know that they are dogs because I recognize in them these universal dog qualities that give them their dogness. So the dogness which I found in Lassie is also in the millions of other substances that have the form of dogness in common. This common form is called the commensurate universal. Commensurate universal. It's the essential nature or essence of something. In the case of dogs, this essence can be described as what it is to be a dog, the dogness, what it is to be a dog, right? The what is the essential nature of being a dog? What is the essence of being a dog? What is the commensurate universal of being a dog? Now, Aristotle differs from Plato in that he maintains that it's absolutely in the substance that the essence lies. There's nothing otherworldly about the forms. The form has to lie in the individual. The individual has substance, yes, but it has also form. If I want to know the form, I have to look at the thing. But he goes further, and he claims that the senses do not hinder knowledge. May I remind you, Plato was against the senses. The senses deceive you. If you want to know the truth, if you want to know the reality of forms and the reality of ideas, you have to approach them rationally. Aristotle says, no, 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 the senses do not hinder knowledge. On the contrary, not only do they not hinder knowledge, on the contrary, it's through the senses that we begin to gain knowledge. We gain knowledge by hearing and seeing Lassie. We know Lassie by being aware of it, by perceiving Lassie, by seeing and hearing its dogness and smelling its dog qualities. Dogs have this particular smell about them. If you haven't grown around dogs, you're even more perhaps aware of it. This smell of dogs, but not just the smell. It's about looking at a dog and seeing it for a dog. It's about hearing a dog and knowing it for it being a dog. By seeing and hearing Lassie's dogness, I can immediately start to gain knowledge about what? About Lassie's essence, about what makes Lassie Lassie. It's through me perceiving Lassie as a dog that I can understand, that I can know about its essence, about what makes it, what makes it a dog. And this happens through sensory perception. After sensory perception of something, we then gain genuine knowledge in the judgment that we perceive has this particular form. When we perceive something, when we perceive a dog, it has to have a particular form. That form is what gives it the dogness. And then from repeated perceptions, experience is born. We can claim then experience. The judgments of experience would then be universal. So, subsequently, then, while we receive objects through our senses, we understand the universal experience through what Aristotle calls the nous or the mind. So, this is then where understanding happens. First, we receive objects through our senses, then we understand them through our mind. Aristotle calls it the nous, Nous, rationality. So, again, the senses are given their due merit in Aristotle's philosophy. Plato plays them down, Aristotle plays them up. He gives them their due. Now, moving on, we'll be talking about man as a rational animal. And different things have different characteristics. So, for instance, according to Aristotle, plants, for example, have a what we call a nutritive principle. Animal, which means that plants, part of the plant's soul, is the fact that it has nutrition. Then you have animals, which sort of in a hierarchy of being would be one step up. And animals would have an instinctual principle. So, on top of the nutritive principle, they have an instinctual principle, this instinct, this sense of mobility and sensation, the sensitive soul, we can call it, that marks their difference from plants. Then we have human beings, and human beings share characteristics with the others. Fair enough. So they have nutrition, as we have nutrition, we have instincts, etc. But then we have a rational principle which sets us apart from other substances, even from animals. We are able to carry out rationally formulated projects. Rationality is our function, what Aristotle calls the ergon, the function. Therefore, our flourishing, our reaching eudaimonia, is therefore rational activity performed well. What do we mean by performed well? It means performed in accordance with virtue. In politics, we have Aristotle claiming that we are a social being too. And the quote goes something like this, right? It says that man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally, so someone who is not social, naturally unsocial, not because not accidentally, is either beneath our notice or more than human. So essentially, what he's saying is that should there be an individual, a human being, right, that is naturally unsocial, we would either not notice that person because we perceive socially. When we perceive each other, we're perceiving each other socially. Or that someone is more than human. What does more than human mean? Essentially, it's a deity. It's a person, but it's not a human being. It's a deity. It's a god. Gods don't need to socialize. Perhaps some types of animals don't need to be recognized socially, but if you are a human being, you need to be perceived, which links up with other philosophers that we'll be covering in the future. One of them claiming that to be is to be perceived. But society, continues Aristotle, is something that precedes the individual. So society is something that comes before the individual. And anyone who either cannot lead the common life, that cannot fit in, right, the rest of society, or is so self-sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, that therefore doesn't interact with society, is either a beast or a god. Everyone else is a social animal. That last phrase is mine, not Aristotle, but it's Aristotle in summation. I'm gonna read it once more, and I'm gonna read it in one flow now without the interruptions. So hopefully it makes a bit more sense after the explanation. So here goes Aristotle's quote from Politics. Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self sufficient as not to need to, and therefore does not partake of society, is either a beast or a god. So human beings are by nature part of a social group. Society allows us to gain and develop our potential. And unconnected life doesn't really satisfy us. On the other hand, we find fulfillment in social connections and friendships. We are naturally suited to a life in a community. According to Aristotle, we don't really fully realize our natures until we exercise the role of citizens. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes this claim. It's a almost anthropological claim. He says that we may even see in our travels how near and dear every man is to every other. So essentially, he's making a claim here that even if you travel, even if you had to see different societies, other societies, you would notice that this is not something just found only in Greece, that we are social animals. You find this also elsewhere, in other places. So essentially, what he's aiming for is some sort of theory about human beings. You can confirm this theory by looking elsewhere. When you look in other places, you'll see that human beings also seem to gather in groups. Philosophy also discusses friendships, right? When we say that we are a social animal, Aristotle also discusses friendships, and he identifies three kinds. He identifies friendships of pleasure, right? Friendships of utility and friendships of virtue. The most complete type of friendship is the friendship of good people similar to each other in virtue. When people have the same sort of level of virtue, this seems to be the most beneficial. This seems to be the best type of virtue. When you are matched, these types of virtues would be true, perfect friendships. Why? Because they wish each other the same sort of good things. Friends of this sort do not see friendships as something to be exploited, but as something that is valuable in and of itself. Therefore, such people, Aristotle claims, are rare. So when you happen to come across a relationship like this, where you value each other and you have similar virtuousness, and that is a type of friendship where you can mutually wish each other well and you can help each other grow. That is very rare indeed. So Aristotle's advice would be to make the most of that. We have covered here an introduction to metaphysics. We've now introduced the topic of metaphysics. We've looked at being and becoming. We have looked at potentiality and actuality. We've had a look at the four causes of being, also Aristotle's theory of knowledge, his idea of man as a rational being, as well as man as a social being. And if you have any questions, feel free. If anything is unclear, please do ask whatever questions you have to ask, and of course I'll get back to you.